In 1989, Nintendo's Game Boy arrived and completely changed the handheld gaming landscape. Then Atari entered the fight with the amazing Lynx and offered something Nintendo's machine couldn't offer: colour graphics. But in 1990, Sega decided to go one step further. The Game Gear arrived with a full colour backlit screen and hardware based on Sega's Master System, essentially putting a colour version of Sega's home console technology in the palm of your hand. Nintendo had the battery life, Atari had the colour, but Sega wanted a piece of the action and wanted to show the world what an 8-bit handheld could really do. While Nintendo built an empire on 4 shades of olive green, Sega brought a portable nuclear warhead to the playground. The Game Gear was essentially a modified version of the Master System architecture, but with a much richer colour display that left players wondering how on earth an 8-bit handheld was pulling off this kind of visual sorcery. To achieve these ambitious graphical feats on a pocket-sized display, Sega packed some serious silicon into this heavy grey shell. Powering the console was an 8-bit Z-Log Z80 processor running at 3.58 MHz, driving visuals onto a bright 3.2-inch backlit colour LCD display. The system boasted an astounding palette of 4,096 total colours, with up to 32 on screen at once, while custom sprite hardware could render up to 64 individual sprites simultaneously, allowing games to fill the display with dense, chaotic action without breaking a sweat. I'm Ash, this is Popcorn Respawn, and today we're counting down 15 games that pushed Sega's battery-sucking handheld to its absolute limits. Takara took SNK's enormous arcade weapon fighter and somehow squeezed it onto the Game Gear. Obviously, plenty of compromises had to be made, but the fighters remained surprisingly large and recognisable, with their signature weapons and special attacks intact. The stages also retain the distinctive Japanese-inspired artwork that made the original so memorable. Seeing a game like Samurai Showdown running on an 8-bit handheld is impressive enough. Seeing it actually resemble Samurai Showdown is really the crazy part. This is the sort of conversion that you can immediately understand what the developers were trying to preserve. The characters still have their identities, the weapons are still central to the combat, and the colourful stages retain the spirit of the arcade original. It's nowhere near the Neo Geo experience, of course, but that isn't really the point. The achievement is getting this kind of fighting game onto a handheld at all. Moving away from Sonic's usual high-speed platforming, Tails' adventure takes a much slower and more exploratory approach, and that slower pace gives the artist room to fill the screen with an impressive amount of environmental detail. Forests, lava-filled caverns, underground areas and colourful landscapes all give the game a surprisingly rich visual identity. Tails himself also has a wide range of animations and equipment, making this feel much more like an adventure game than a traditional Sonic spin-off. It might not be the fastest game on this list, but visually, Tails' Adventure is one of the most polished. The slower gameplay also means you actually have time to appreciate what's on screen instead of blasting through each stage at Sonic speed. There's a surprising amount of variety in the environments, and the colourful artwork gives the game a distinctive personality. By 1995, Sega's developers had clearly learned how to get a huge amount of character and atmosphere out of this little handheld. Probe Software did an impressive job of bringing the bleak atmosphere of Alien 3 to the Game Gear. The industrial corridors are dark, claustrophobic and packed with metallic scenery that gives the game an appropriately oppressive feel. But the real star is the xenomorphs. Watching these creatures crawl around the environment while you're trying to navigate the corridors creates a surprisingly convincing sense of danger. The visuals may be limited by the hardware, but Alien 3 proves that clever artwork and animation can create atmosphere without needing a huge amount of processing power. and that's what makes it stand out from some of the more colourful games on this list. Instead of relying on bright colours and huge characters, Alien 3 uses dark and restricted visibility to create tension. The result is a game that feels much more mature and atmospheric than you might expect from a handheld released in the early 90s. For an Alien game, that's exactly what you want. Released exclusively in Japan late in the Game Gear's lifespan, Sylvan Tale is one of the system's great hidden gems. This top-down action RPG looks remarkably close to the kind of Zelda-style adventure you'd expect from a far more powerful console. The overworld is filled with lush scenery, shimmering water and vibrant environments, while the dungeons are surprisingly intricate and rewarding to explore. What makes it so impressive is just how confidently the developers pushed the hardware. By this point, they had years of experience with the Game Gear, and Sylvan Tales feels like the result of knowing exactly how to get the most out of it. The top-down perspective also gives the game plenty of room to show off its visual strengths. Detailed environments, expressive artwork and smooth presentation came together to create a world that feels far more substantial than you'd expect from an 8-bit handheld, and considering it arrived so late in the system's life, Sylvan Tale almost feels like a final statement from the Game Gear's developers, a glimpse of just how much the ageing hardware was still capable of when pushed to its limits. Electronic Arts' brutal motorcycle racer looked completely ridiculous on paper as an 8-bit handheld conversion, and yeah, let's be real, it's probably running at about 10 frames per second. But come on, this is Road Rash running on a Game Gear. Yet somehow it actually works. You're tearing down undulating roads, dodging oncoming traffic and swinging fists at rivals while the Z80 CPU fights for its life handling 3D road math and software simulated sprite scaling. Watching an opponent scale up frame by frame right into your punching radius is a stunning technical feat for an 8-bit machine. This isn't just a basic racing game squeezed into a portable. It's a full-fat Road Rash complete with the violence, combat and attitude running right in your pocket. The frame rate takes a hit, but the sheer ambition makes it a pure handheld spectacle. Sega took an ambitious approach with Jurassic Park, combining different styles of gameplay to create a surprisingly varied experience. The on-foot side-scrolling sections feature some impressively large dinosaurs, including Dilophosaurus and T-Rex encounters that occupy a serious amount of screen. Then the game switches things up with driving and shooting sections where you're suddenly dealing with dinosaurs approaching your Jeep. It's not the same Jurassic Park experience you got on the more powerful consoles, but that's exactly what makes this version so interesting. The developers were clearly determined to make the most of what they had. The dinosaurs are the obvious stars visually because seeing creatures this large moving around the screen immediately grabs your attention. Then the game completely changes perspective, giving you another demonstration of what could be achieved with the same limited hardware. It's ambitious, unusual and technically fascinating, which is exactly why it deserves a place on this list. West Samurai Showdown relied on heavy weapon spacing. Fatal Fury Special was built for raw arcade speed. Squeezing SNK's massive arcade fighter onto a handheld required Takara to max out a massive 8 megabit cartridge, one of the largest on the system, and rethink their entire design strategy. Rather than cramming bloated arcade sprites onto a tiny screen, the developers completely redrew 9 characters with bold, high-contrast models. This didn't just keep the visuals sharp, it actively fought against the Game Gear's infamous display ghosting. To maintain high frame rates and crisp inputs, Takara made the tough call to cut the arcade's multi-plane lane switching, locking combat strictly to a single 2D plane. That sacrifice paid off massively. It freed up the Z80 to handle fluid animation and full special movesets, right down to those devastating desperation moves. It's a brilliant example of smart hardware optimization, proving that tailoring a game to a handheld's specific limitations yields far better results than a lazy carbon copy. Sims created a completely different take on Aladdin for the 8-bit hardware, and visually it's one of the most impressive Disney games on the system. The character animation is remarkably expressive, with Aladdin moving through Agrabah with a level of fluidity that's genuinely impressive for an 8-bit handheld. The environments are colourful and packed with visual detail, from the rooftops of Agrabah to the game's darker cave sections. It may not be the same game as the famous 16-bit Genesis version, but Sims managed to give this tiny screen plenty of that unmistakable Disney visual magic. When you see Aladdin jumping and swinging through these colourful stages, it's easy to forget you're looking at hardware that was designed at the end of the 1980s. This is exactly the kind of game that made Game Gear owners show their friends what Sega's handheld could do. Sega's shooting mascot made a stunning transition to the portable screen in this 1995 release. Ristar is an absolute showcase for the Game Gear's colour capabilities, with each world bringing its own distinctive palette and colourful scenery, but it's the animation that really stands out. Ristar's entire character design revolves around those elastic arms, and watching them stretch, grab enemies and interact with the environment is incredibly fluid. For a machine with an 8-bit processor and a tiny 160 by 144 display, Ristar looks ridiculously ambitious. The game also manages to retain the bizarre, colourful personality of the original rather than simply feel like a stripped-down platformer. These colourful planets, imaginative enemies and constantly moving character animations give almost every screen something interesting to look at. Ristar arrived late in the Game Gear's life, and it shows just how much developers had learnt about the hardware by this point. Bringing Streets of Rage 2 to an 8-bit handheld meant making some serious compromises, but Sega still managed to squeeze an impressive beat-em-up experience onto the system. The characters are surprisingly recognisable, and the stages retain the gritty urban atmosphere of the original. Multiple enemies can appear on screen while you're throwing punches, kicks and special attacks, and the whole thing actually feels like Streets of Rage. It isn't the Mega Drive version, and it doesn't pretend to be, but seeing this kind of side-scrolling brawler running on a handheld this small is still pretty damn impressive. The limited screen resolution could have made a beat-em-up frustrating, yet the action remains readable and the characters retain their personalities. Considering the Mega Drive original was designed around much more powerful hardware, getting even this much of Streets of Rage 2 into a handheld is a technical achievement in itself. Shinobi is a masterclass in atmospheric colour design. Sega uses deep blues, purples and dark tones to create a surprisingly moody world for such a small screen. Joe Musashi is beautifully animated as he runs, jumps, somersaults and slices his way through enemy-filled stages. And then the bosses arrive. Some of these encounters occupy a huge portion of the screen, creating some seriously impressive moments for an 8-bit action game. It might be small enough to fit in your pocket, but Shinobi 2 certainly doesn't think small. The darker palette also gave the game an atmosphere that many colour handheld titles simply didn't have. There's a real sense of danger as Joe moves through the enemy bases, with the contrast between his bright character sprites and the dark environments making the action immediately readable. It's proof that great visuals aren't always about throwing more colours onto the screen. Compile pushed the hardware to its absolute breaking point with Power Strike 2, known in Japan as GG Aleste 2. This thing is relentless. Enemy craft pour onto the screen, bullet patterns fill the display, and enormous bosses completely dwarf your tiny ship. Then you've got explosions, power-ups, scrolling environments, and an almost constant stream of action happening simultaneously. It's one of those games where you look at the screen and genuinely wonder how an 8-bit handheld is managing to keep everything moving. And this isn't a slow-paced shooter where the developers can carefully control what appears on screen. The action is fast, aggressive, and deliberately overwhelming. The sheer amount of activity makes Power Strike 2 one of the clearest demonstrations of what skilled programmers could achieve once they really understood the hardware. If you want a single game that demonstrates just how far developers had learned to push this machine, Power Strike 2 is one hell of an example. Porting Treasure's chaotic 16-bit masterpiece to an 8-bit handheld sounded like a suicide mission, but M2 somehow managed to pull it off. Instead of neutering the action, this conversion captures the frantic spirit of the Mega Drive original astonishingly well. You've got swarms of enemies, screen-filling explosions, and complex multi-jointed bosses completely dominating that tiny display, all running simultaneously without melting the Z80 processor. Naturally, M2 had to make visual compromises to squeeze Treasure's manic code onto limited hardware, but that's precisely why it's so impressive. Gunstar Heroes doesn't feel like a typical scaled-back port. It feels like someone dared the developers to do the impossible, and they gave it a bloody good try. Developed by Aspect, Sonic the Hedgehog Triple Trouble represents the visual peak of the 8-bit Sonic games. The game makes fantastic use of the system's colour capabilities, filling its stages with saturated backgrounds, vibrant scenery, and some surprisingly elaborate environments. Sonic moves through the levels with impressive speed, while the game throws in some genuinely ambitious set pieces. From snowboarding down icy slopes to piloting a pseudo 3D biplane, Triple Trouble constantly finds new ways to make this little handheld feel considerably more powerful than it actually was. And it's not just the scenery that's impressive. Sonic himself is packed with animation, and the game manages to keep the action feeling fast and responsive despite the limitations of the hardware. For an 8-bit Sonic game released in 1994, Triple Trouble really does feel like Aspect was determined to squeeze every last drop of performance out of the machine. Closing our list is Iguana Entertainment's energetic Game Gear version of NBA Jam. The developers brought the famous 2-on-2 arcade formula to the handheld, complete with recognisable players, fast gameplay, and those ridiculous over-the-top dunks. The court scrolls smoothly as the action moves from end to end, while the player animations capture some of the unmistakable NBA Jam energy. It obviously isn't the arcade original, but the fact that you could play NBA Jam on a tiny colour handheld in 1994 is impressive in itself. And that's why it's a fitting way to finish the list. This isn't about impressive scenery or flashy graphics. It's about taking a fast-paced arcade sports game and making it work on hardware you could fit in your hands. For 1994, that's one hell of a technical achievement. The Sega Game Gear was a system defined by raw ambition. While its hunger for 6 AA batteries and its bulky footprint kept it from stealing Nintendo's crown, these 15 games prove that Sega's portable hardware was capable of far more than its 8-bit specifications would suggest. Developers found clever ways to create huge characters, colourful worlds, fast scrolling, and an incredible amount of action on a screen measuring just 160 by 144 pixels. And that's what makes the Game Gear so fascinating. It wasn't the most successful handheld of its generation, it wasn't the most practical, and it certainly wasn't kind to your wallet when it came to batteries. But when developers really pushed it, this little grey machine could produce some genuinely jaw-dropping results. So now it's over to you. Which of these Game Gear showcases surprised you the most, and have I completely ballsed it up and missed an absolute classic? As always, let me know in the comments below. I love reading your old school memories and hearing which games you remember playing back in the day. If you enjoyed this retro hardware deep dive, hit the like button and subscribe to Popcorn Respawn if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and until the next time, see ya!
Ooh, videos and I am alive.